Ever since he was a kid, Carl Jung had strange experiences that couldn't be explained by science. Growing up, he often heard stories about odd events like dreams predicting deaths, clocks stopping at the moment someone passed, or glasses breaking for no clear reason. In his childhood world, everyone simply accepted these things as real. Jung's personal encounters with the paranormal fueled his lifelong search for explanations, leading him to develop his theory of analytical psychology and dive into parapsychology, the study of extrasensory perception, precognition, telepathy, intuition, and other unexplained phenomena. Paranormal happenings seemed almost normal in Jung's family. His maternal grandfather, Reverend Samuel Piqued, believed Hebrew was the language of heaven and regularly spoke with the spirit of his first wife, keeping a chair ready for her every week, much to the frustration of his second wife, Augusta. Augusta herself was clairvoyant, a gift she supposedly gained after falling into a coma for 36 hours at age 20. She often saw ghostly figures she didn't know, only for history to confirm they had once lived. This mystical streak ran deep in the family, carried further by Jung's mother, Emily Preiswerk, who experienced so many unusual things that she kept a special diary just for them. Her father even had her sit behind him while he wrote sermons to fend off spirit disturbances. Emily often stayed in a separate bedroom, claiming to be visited by spirits at night. Jung remembered his mother as having two sides. During the day, she was warm and nurturing, but at night, her presence filled him with unease, very different from his steady, predictable father. Interestingly, both of his parents were the 13th children in their families. Jung himself had vivid experiences. As a child, he once saw a strange figure whose head detached and floated ahead like a little moon, a sight that repeated several times. Later, while working as a young doctor in Zurich, he was running word association experiments when his mother visited. She glanced at his wall full of charts, looked confused, and asked what they were. Jung explained, and then her voice shifted to a deeper, more intuitive tone. "Well, do you think it could be something?" she asked. This rare shift made Jung stop and question if what he was doing truly mattered. Jung also saw himself as having two personalities: personality no. 1, which helped him fit into society, and personality number 2, which felt ancient, wise, and deeply connected to nature, dreams, and the divine. One morning in 1898, while studying at home, he heard a loud crack. A heavy walnut table passed down through his family for generations had split in two without reason. 2 weeks later, he heard another noise and found a bread knife shattered into 4 pieces inside a cupboard. Jung kept these broken pieces as reminders of the unseen forces at work. His family still holds onto them today. He later admitted that these events were tied to spirit sessions or séances he had been attending for some time at home. His cousin, Helen Preiswerk, acted as the medium, and the spirits they contacted were often their own ancestors. As a student, Jung often discussed topics like the soul, spirits, psychokinesis, messages from the dead, hypnosis, clairvoyance, and prophetic dreams in a club called the Sophingia Lectures. He believed that trying to explain these things scientifically would always fall short because they didn't follow the normal rules of cause and effect. After all, how could someone's death in New York cause a clock to stop in Europe, or someone there to dream about it before it even happened? Jung thought it was incredibly hard for Western minds, so tied to the idea of causality, to accept the possibility of connections without clear causes. In contrast, Eastern traditions like the I Ching, which fascinated Jung, had embraced a causal thinking for thousands of years. Jung turned to the I Ching during key moments in his life and in his work with patients. finding it full of deep, meaningful insights. He could recall all 64 hexagrams by heart and saw them as living archetypes. Jung continued attending séances and even ran experiments with mediums, where he witnessed strange phenomena like objects appearing out of nowhere, disappearing, and even levitation. He insisted he had personally seen these events happen multiple times, under conditions where there was no room for tricks. He once wrote that rejecting such eyewitness accounts would be like dismissing all human testimony entirely. At one séance, 4 of the 5 people present claimed to see a glowing orb floating over the medium's abdomen, but Jung, strangely, saw nothing. This led him to wonder if some visions, like sightings of flying saucers, might be collective hallucinations rather than individual experiences. Jung's experiences at these séances formed the foundation of his doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena. Part of Collected Works, Volume 1. He was careful to keep his personal involvement muted in his writings, striving to stay objective. Even so, he acknowledged that many of his later ideas took root during this time. While he knew plenty of frauds existed in the spiritualist world, he believed some genuine psychic phenomena were happening. Watching his cousin Helen Preiswerk channel different personalities during trances sparked Jung's thinking about complexes and archetypes. It was through these experiences that he got his first real glimpse of the unconscious, a hidden world working independently of our waking minds. In a letter, Jung shared his frustrations about trying to prove spirit communication. He admitted there were no solid cases where spirits presented themselves clearly, making it impossible to tell whether a message came from a ghost, a medium's subconscious, or even someone else's imagination. He didn't deny it could happen, but he said, proving it was beyond human ability. He believed the entire field of occult phenomena was a massive challenge for the mind, not something anyone could approach naively. When Jung aligned himself with Freud, he continued studying the paranormal, even though Freud had little patience for it. Freud wanted psychoanalysis centered firmly on sexual theory, to shield it from what he saw as the dangerous pull of occultism. Yet later, Freud admitted in a letter to Jung that he had grown more humble about such matters. Still, he kept his interests in the paranormal mostly private. One night in 1909, during a heated discussion about psychic events, Freud had just formally declared Jung as his crown prince and successor. As they argued, Jung suddenly felt as if his chest was made of red-hot iron, and moments later, a loud, cracking sound came from a bookcase. Jung said it was an example of psychokinesis, but Freud brushed it off. Jung warned there would be more. And sure enough, another loud crack followed. Freud was left staring in disbelief. Near the end of his life in 1961, Jung wrote that he had seen objects move without being touched, under conditions that ruled out fraud. He described it not so much as levitation, but more like invisible hands, lifting, shaking, or throwing things. Jung and other witnesses even felt the touch of what seemed like a hand during these events. He stressed that these incidents only happened when the medium was deep in a trance, with no conscious control. He considered them poltergeist-like happenings. Jung's disagreements with Freud over the paranormal were one of the many reasons for their eventual split. Afterward, Jung plunged into a period of intense inner exploration. His confrontation with the unconscious, where he experienced visions, met inner figures, and recorded everything in his personal journals, later known as the Black Books, and eventually the Red Book. One of the inner figures Jung encountered was Philemon, a kind of wise pagan spirit with an Egypto-Hellenistic look and a Gnostic feel. Philemon showed Jung that there are parts of the psyche we don't create. They exist and live on their own. One of Jung's earliest brushes with what he later called synchronicity involved Philemon. He dreamed of Philemon with kingfisher wings and decided to paint the image. While working on it, he found a dead kingfisher in his garden, the only time that ever happened. An odd, powerful coincidence that stayed with him. It was during casual dinners with Albert Einstein that Jung first started thinking about time being relative, just like space, and how both might be shaped by the psyche. This idea led, decades later, to his collaboration with Nobel Prize physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and to his development of the concept of synchronicity. As physics wrestled with the causality and the relativity of space-time in quantum mechanics, Jung realized the mind faced a similar puzzle. He wrote that synchronicity suggests moving objects have a psychoid nature, something both psychic and physical, beyond space, time, and causality as we usually understand them. Jung believed we had to let go of the idea that the mind is simply tied to the brain. After all, even lower life forms without brains showed intelligent behavior. This, to him, hinted at a broader reality. For Jung, ESP wasn't just a human quirk. It was a sign that the collective unconscious touched not only people, but animals and even physical events. In his view, psyche and matter weren't separate. They existed inside and around each other, like the old Hermetic idea, as above, so below. Different cultures had called this interconnectedness by many names: unus mundus, pleroma, anima mundi, cosmic sympathy, and others. Some people seemed able to tap into this hidden world almost at will, but Jung thought it wasn't about magic. It was about falling into an archetypal state where deeper forces could work through them. In religion, the act of surrendering to God mirrored this same psychological move, letting the ego yield to the greater self. Before World War I, Jung had terrifying visions of Europe drowning in blood and chaos. At the time, he didn't know what they meant, but after the war broke out, he realized they had been true premonitions. Toward the end of his life, he had another grim vision, foreseeing devastation across the earth. Not total, but massive, which was recorded only in his daughter's notes. His close colleague, Marie-Louise von Franz, also recounted a final vision Jung had on his deathbed, where he saw vast stretches of land laid waste. During World War II, while riding a train back to Bollingen, Jung was suddenly overwhelmed by the image of someone drowning. When he got home, he found out that at exactly that moment, one of his grandsons had nearly drowned and had been saved by his older brother. Before he died, Jung experienced something similar involving his wife's family. He dreamed of a grave-like bed, heard a deep sigh, and saw a figure rise up, wearing a white gown with black markings. When he woke at 3 in the morning, he checked on his wife. Later that morning, he received word that her cousin had died at exactly 3 o'clock. Jung also had a strange mystical experience when he visited Ravenna, Italy. The first time, in 1913, he found the tomb of Roman Empress Galla Placidia deeply moving. When he returned 20 years later, he felt the same powerful pull. Inside the tomb, he entered a strange mood again. Then, stepping into the Orthodox baptistry, he found himself bathed in a gentle blue light. Oddly, he didn't question it at all. Where he remembered windows from his earlier visit, there were now 4 magnificent mosaic frescoes he seemed to have forgotten completely. The 4th mosaic, in particular, left him completely awestruck. The last mosaic, Jung and his companion looked at, showed Christ reaching out to save Peter, who was sinking beneath the waves. They stood there for about 20 minutes, talking about how early baptism rituals were often tied to the idea of death and rebirth. Jung remembered the mosaic so clearly that even years later, he could see every detail in his mind. Afterward, he went to Alinari, hoping to buy photographs of the mosaics, but couldn't find any. Later, he asked a friend visiting Ravenna to get pictures for him, but again, none could be found. It turned out the mosaics Jung had described didn't actually exist. His companion, Tony Wolff, who had seen them too, found it hard to accept at first. Still, they confirmed that they had both seen the same images. Jung considered the experience one of the most mysterious events of his life. In 1944, Jung had a near-death experience that gave him a brief look behind the curtain of existence. Losing Tony Wolff and then Emma Jung made him reflect even more on life after death. Near the end of his life, he said Tony had been the fragrance of his days, while Emma had been the foundation. Jung believed Tony, who was naturally down to earth, had drifted too far into intellectual pursuits. He also reflected on reincarnation, thinking that if it's real, it might mean people return because they left something unfinished. In a dream, he saw Tony reborn as a farmer in the Umbrian countryside of Italy, glowing with a physical vitality she hadn't had in life. He felt Tony was now closer to the earth and more tangible in the three-dimensional world. With Emma, the connection felt different. After her death, Jung dreamed of her working on her Holy Grail studies, but she seemed distant, like she had moved further along a spiritual path he couldn't reach. In 1916, during a restless period filled with a heavy, strange atmosphere, Jung felt compelled to give voice to thoughts he believed were coming from Philemon. This led to the 7 Sermons to the Dead, a series of mystical writings he published anonymously under the name Basilides, a figure from early Christian Gnosticism. It started with a feeling that something had to happen. The house became so heavy and filled with a ghostly presence that it was hard to breathe. His daughter, Agatha, who had psychic sensitivities, also saw spirits. One Sunday afternoon, the front doorbell rang wildly. Jung described feeling the air packed with unseen beings. He was full of questions when the spirits seemed to cry out in unison, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought." After that, the writing of the 7 sermons flowed out of him over 3 nights. Once he finished, the spirits vanished and the house returned to normal. Jung later said, "The 7 sermons contained the seed of everything he would later express about the unconscious, individuation, archetypes, the tension between opposites, and the idea of the self." After the haunting, he drew his first mandala, Systema Mundi Totius, a kind of cosmic map of what he had experienced. It was shown anonymously at the Eranos conferences. The mandala depicted the conflict between the microcosm and the macrocosm, and included the figure of Abraxas, a Gnostic being who symbolized the dark, ambiguous creator of the physical world. From Abraxas sprouted the tree of life, and the lower world was marked by symbols of life, death, and rebirth, like a monstrous creature and a larva. Jung said that, from that time on, the voices of the dead became clearer to him. He found it striking that the dead didn't seem to know any more than they had while alive, which was very different from traditional beliefs that the dead are wise. Instead, Jung came to see that the dead were still in the process of learning, and that their growth somehow depended on the living, raising their own consciousness. For Jung, death didn't end development. It simply opened a new, unfinished chapter. In Jung's view, through our growth and development on Earth, we actually help the dead continue their own evolution after death. In 1911, while biking through Italy with a friend, Jung had a vivid dream. In it, he found himself among a group of distinguished spirits from earlier centuries. They spoke in Latin. One man, wearing a long curly wig, asked Jung a difficult question, though Jung couldn't remember exactly what it was after waking. He understood the man, but couldn't reply properly in Latin. The feeling of humiliation was so strong, it woke him up. The moment he woke, he thought about the book he was writing, Psychology of the Unconscious, later titled Symbols of Transformation. The experience left him so shaken that he abandoned the bike trip and took the train straight home to get back to work. Years later, Jung realized that the man in the dream was a kind of ancestral spirit who had asked him a question he wasn't ready to answer yet. But by working on his book, he felt he was helping to provide an answer the spirit had been seeking, an answer that had to be created by future generations. In a foreword to Fanny Moser's book, Ghost, False Belief, or True, Jung shared his thoughts on these matters. He wrote that the world of ghost stories is a strange one, where anything seems possible, but nothing seems completely believable. He recalled Kant's wise view, that ghost stories would always have secret believers, even if public opinion rejected them. Kant had said that even while doubting individual stories, he still held a certain faith in the collection of them as a whole. Jung thought many skeptics would do well to adopt that same cautious, open-minded stance. Jung also shared one of his own personal encounters. In the summer of 1920, during a lecture trip to England, he rented a cheap cottage for several weekends. At night, the atmosphere in the cottage would grow stifling with an awful smell. He heard water dripping, even though there were no pipes nearby. As the nights went on, it got worse. Sounds of brushing against walls, knocking and rustling filled the room, like the roar of an oncoming storm. Jung even sensed something like a frantic dog dashing about, but all the activity would vanish with the first light of dawn. He noticed the housemaids never stayed past sunset. When he asked them about it, they simply said, "It's haunted, didn't you know?" One night, he woke feeling a presence beside him. Opening his eyes, he saw the head of an old woman lying on the pillow next to him. Her right eye stared wide open at him, while the left half of her face was missing below the eye. The sight shocked him so badly, he jumped out of bed, lit a candle, and spent the rest of the night in a chair. His skeptical friend, Dr. X, agreed to stay in the house one weekend to see for himself. After experiencing similar things, Dr. X refused to spend another night inside and slept outside in the garden. Not long after, the haunted cottage was torn down. In the spring of 1924, Jung was alone at his Bollingen tower. One night, he awoke to the sound of soft footsteps circling the tower. Faint music and the sound of people laughing and talking filled the air. When he looked outside, he saw nothing. Believing he had dreamed it, he went back to sleep, only for the same dream to immediately start again. This time, he saw hundreds of shadowy figures coming down from the mountains and surrounding the tower. Again, he jumped up and checked, but outside it was silent under a bright, still moon. Jung later noted that in this type of dream, unlike regular ones, the unconscious seemed determined to make the dream feel as real as possible. Emphasized by the repetition, he never had another experience quite like it. Later on, Jung found a 17th century chronicle describing something very similar. A traveler alone in the mountains had reported a nighttime vision of a procession of men playing music and singing near his hut. When he asked a local shepherd about it, he was told it was Wotan's army of wandering souls, said to appear to lonely travelers. Jung also thought of another historical parallel. the Reisläufer, the Swiss mercenary troops, who every spring gathered to sing and say farewell before marching off to Italy. These echoes between history, myth, and his own visions made a lasting impression on him. Jung believed he might have witnessed one of those past gatherings, suggesting synchronicity could explain it. He once recalled a strange incident where, during a dinner, he described the life of an imaginary criminal without realizing that the man sitting across from him matched the description perfectly. Jung wrote, "I too have this archaic side, and in me, it's tied to the gift, though not always a pleasant one, of seeing people and things as they truly are. I can fool myself all the way to Tipperary if I want to avoid recognizing something. But deep down, I usually know the truth. I'm like a dog. You can trick him, but he'll still sniff out what's real in the end." For Jung, this kind of insight came from instinct or a deep mystical connection with others, almost like seeing through a set of invisible eyes operating behind the scenes. In 1927, Jung's friend H passed away. About 6 months before his death, Jung had dreamed that they were traveling together by car toward Luxor, on the east side of the Nile. Across the river lay the Theban necropolis, the city of the dead. A few weeks after H's death, Jung had another dream where they were in a restaurant in Luxor. H said emotionally, "You know I'm alive. You don't have to think I'm dead. I'm just as alive as you." But then H got too close, and Jung caught a strong, sickening smell of decay, so he kept him away with a machete. After H's funeral, Jung had a vision of H standing at the foot of his bed, beckoning him to follow. H led him to his study and pointed toward a shelf lined with red-covered books. Later, Jung visited H's widow and asked to see the study. Sure enough, he found a book titled The Legacy of the Dead. Jung also spoke of another patient he helped pull out of depression. Unfortunately, the man's wife grew jealous of Jung's influence. Although Jung felt uneasy about her, the man went home, married her, and quickly fell under tremendous pressure he couldn't handle. Within a year, he sank back into depression. Jung had told him to reach out if things worsened, but the man, under his wife's influence, never did. One night after a lecture, Jung returned to his hotel and woke around 2 a.m, feeling that someone had entered the room, though he found no one there. He then noticed a dull pain in his forehead and the back of his skull. The next day, news arrived that his former patient had shot himself. The bullet had lodged at the back of his skull. Jung recognized this as a genuine synchronistic event, the kind that often appears around moments tied to death. Sometimes, archetypes also show up as real objects that seem to respond to psychic events. Jung's famous story of the scarab beetle is one example. He had been treating a woman who was extremely rational and dismissive of anything unconscious. One day, as she was describing a dream about a golden scarab, a real beetle, very much resembling a scarab, began tapping against the window. Jung caught it, handed it to her, and the experience finally broke through her intellectual defenses, opening her up to deeper inner work. Jung saw this as the unconscious attempting to balance her psyche, using a real-world event to reach her when logic had failed. In religious language, such happenings are often called acts of God, and Jung agreed that was an apt description. Jung wrote that during moments of severe distress, sickness, danger, life-threatening crises, even people without religious beliefs often find themselves praying instinctively. In those moments, the archetype of a divine helper is awakened, and sometimes a sudden, almost miraculous shift occurs. These kinds of life or death turning points have happened throughout human history. In such times, instinct becomes vital because reason simply isn't enough. Instinct shows up in myths and dreams as figures like the helpful animal, the guardian spirit, the angel, the saint, or the savior. Jung liked the old saying, "God is nearest where the need is greatest." Synchronistic events usually occur during emotional intensity, around death, illness, accidents, fear, sorrow, anger, moments when dreams and psychic experiences are often full of archetypal imagery. Most synchronistic experiences appear during such archetypal situations and show up as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and similar phenomena. In 1960, just a year before he died, Jung reflected, "Paranormal psychic phenomena have fascinated me all my life. As I've said before, they usually happen during extreme psychological states, high emotion, depression, shock, and so on." Jung believed that certain individuals, especially those with unusual or pathological personality structures, often had a naturally lower threshold to the collective unconscious. People with creative genius belonged to this group too. It was clear Jung himself was such a creative type, more open to the deeper layers of the psyche. Looking back through human history, he noticed a nearly universal belief in invisible beings, phantoms, spirits, who lived among the living and influenced their lives in unseen but powerful ways. These were usually thought to be the souls of the dead. In Western society, however, belief in spirits had been heavily pushed aside during the Age of Enlightenment, lumped together with other metaphysical ideas that modern rationalism tried to erase. Still, Jung observed that during the materialistic rationalist age, a new kind of spirit belief was making a comeback. But now, on a higher, more reflective level. It wasn't a return to blind superstition, but a deep, serious scientific interest in the spiritual side of life. He wrote, "Rationalism and superstition are two sides of the same coin. Psychologically, the brighter the conscious mind tries to shine, the darker the shadows grow in the unconscious. Rational thinking often serves as a shield against superstition, but the more we suppress it, the more it grows underneath. And just because something can't be explained by science doesn't mean it's false. Only a biased, rigidly materialistic mind would dismiss it out of hand. Many things are simply still unknown." One of Jung's constant themes was the flaw in the modern materialistic mindset, which prides itself on overcoming superstition while blindly placing total faith in reason, another form of irrationalism. In the structure and dynamics of the psyche, Jung discussed why belief in spirits had deep psychological roots. In primitive cultures, losing one's soul was seen as a cause of illness, both mental and physical. Spirits were considered dangerous, and people would avoid haunted places unless they had to confront them for religious or magical reasons. Jung always had a positive view of so-called primitive man, seeing him as still deeply connected to natural forces that modern urban humanity had lost through industrialization. In those societies, sickness had two main causes: soul loss and spirit possession. Jung explained that soul complexes belong to the personal unconscious. Losing them made people ill. But spirit complexes, which came from the collective unconscious, caused illness when they invaded the ego and healing when they were driven out. These ideas mapped perfectly onto Jung's broader theory of how the personal and collective unconscious worked. Reintegration of lost soul complexes often brought healing, but encounters with archetypal forces could be overwhelming and dangerous. Jung studied the spiritualist literature that was popular in his time and concluded that, oddly enough, the goal of spiritualism mirrored the goal of analytical psychology. The spirit's messages, whether real or symbolic, seemed focused on helping the living become more conscious, directly or through the voices of the dead. In Jung's view, science was just one way the mind worked, specifically through the intellect. But a full understanding of life required another function too: feeling. Feelings often brought convictions that the intellect couldn't reach but were just as valid. Because of that, Jung believed we should respect intellect but also accept its limits, even though scientific rigor was necessary when dealing with clear facts and evidence. Early in his career, Jung wasn't focused on asking whether ghosts truly existed. Instead, he was more interested in questions like, who sees the ghost? Under what mental conditions does the sighting happen? What symbolic meaning might the ghost carry? For Jung, the most important thing was the reality of the experience to the person living it. He explained that spirits could be understood as outward projections of unconscious complexes. He wrote, "I see no proof at all for the existence of real spirits, and until such proof shows up, I have to treat this entire territory as a branch of psychology." But over time, Jung's opinion shifted. After decades of gathering experiences from people all around the world, and through his own theoretical work, laid out On the Nature of the Psyche, he admitted he had been led to certain conclusions that now touched on ideas at the very edge of physics. Questions about the nature of space, time, and reality itself. This brings us right into the whole discussion about the reality that lies just beneath the surface of the psyche. Although people often use the terms ghosts and spirits as if they mean the same thing, there's a subtle difference between them. Ghosts can be seen as leftover imprints of energy or snapshots tied to a specific location. They seem stuck, often connected to unfinished business on Earth, and many times they don't even realize they're dead. Their deaths are usually violent or tragic, and they tend to linger in certain places, giving rise to classic hauntings. Spirits, on the other hand, are souls of people, or even animals who have moved on to a spiritual plane. Unlike ghosts, they are aware, active, and conscious. In the foreword to Stuart Edward White's The Unobstructed Universe, Jung wrote that our world of consciousness and the world beyond actually make up one single cosmos. He explained it like this: the living and the dead aren't really in separate places. Instead, they exist at different frequencies, much like the way a propeller's blades vanish at high speed. In psychological terms, this would mean that the conscious and unconscious are not two different worlds, but different energy states of the same thing. What we call the beyond is really the same cosmos, only free from the limits of space and time that restrict living humans. This higher dimension, Jung said, is called orthos, meaning the true or right world. He stressed, though, that this wasn't about devaluing life here on Earth. On the contrary, we should live this limited life as fully and consciously as possible, because achieving maximum consciousness while alive is essential preparation for life in orthos. This idea lines up closely with Plato, who saw philosophy itself as training for death. Even though we might find reasons to doubt each individual case of paranormal experiences, Jung pointed out that there's no solid argument proving spirits don't exist. So, we are left with the mystery, and he warned against assuming too easily that all ghost stories are just tricks or lies. These phenomena, he argued, exist independently of how we interpret them and should be seen as genuine manifestations of the unconscious. If spirit communications really happen spontaneously and aren't just inventions of the conscious mind, then they are real statements about the unconscious. After examining the paranormal from multiple angles throughout his life, Jung admitted he never reached a clear conclusion. Near the end of his life, he said, "I can't claim to have done original research in this area, but I can say without hesitation that I've seen enough to be completely convinced these phenomena are real. However, I can't explain them, nor can I fully endorse any of the usual interpretations." In the end, Jung even admitted that the hypothesis of spirits might explain paranormal phenomena better than trying to reduce them entirely to quirks of the unconscious. He saw them as probably both psychic and spiritual in nature. Throughout his writings, it's clear the paranormal wasn't just a passing interest for Jung. It was woven into his larger worldview and understanding of the psyche. For him, things were never simple because he stayed open to ideas that challenged the mainstream scientific thinking of his time. While science of his day liked to think it had closed the case, Jung saw that it hadn't, and he kept working through the tension between opposing ideas, a true alchemical effort to bring opposites together. His deep confrontation with the unconscious was not easy, but it became the defining experience of his life. An experience he felt could have filled several lifetimes. When asked once whether he believed in God, Jung famously replied, "I don't need to believe, I know." It was this direct, inner knowing, gnosis, that gave him a sense of wholeness and the strength to share his insights with the world.